Hello and welcome to Become the Teapot. I'm Ian.
And so am I. And this is a podcast all about comic books and their adaptations.
So, what are we doing here? Well, we were coming up with ideas for this podcast. We knew we wanted to do something about comics and comic book films. And during this, Ian revealed that although he's a fan of comic book movies, he hasn't actually read that many comics. In fact, most of his knowledge of comics comes from YouTube and Wikipedia, and I suspect that's the case for a lot of people. So, each episode, we are going to take one adaptation and discuss it, as well as a related comic book. From my point of view, this is an excuse for me to get my friend to read more comics, as well as revisiting some of my favourites. And hopefully, these two viewpoints will make for something vaguely interesting to listen to. Whatever your experience, we ask for you to join us. Read and watch along at home, and let us know your thoughts. Think of this as a comic book club. Our first episode is all about X-Men Days of Future Past, the fifth film in Fox's X-Men line, and chronologically, the second and last film in the timeline. Of course, that gets a little bit more complicated if we include the Wolverine movies, where it becomes the seventh film in the franchise and simultaneously the second, third, and penultimate film in continuity. And if that seems complicated to you, then you are really going to have some fun when it comes to the comics. The comic that we'll be reading is the arc from Uncanny X-Men of the same name, a hugely influential story that was also adapted into X-Men the Animated Series and has been referenced in games, in TV, all manner of things. And this is despite the fact that the comic itself is just 2 issues of an ongoing run. With that out of the way, let's talk about X, baby. Ian. We don't have the rights to that.
Oh, sorry.
So, Days of Future Past, what are your thoughts?
Out of the X-Men films,
Mhm.
probably one of my favourite.
Okay.
I mean, I know there are drastic changes from the comics and the film. I knew the basic plot when
Yeah.
I watched it. It being a Fox X-Men film, there are, of course, going to be like plot holes and character changes. And I thought Wolverine being wedged into the storyline is a Fox idea.
Yes.
He sells the money. He makes the money.
He sells the money.
He sells the money. He makes and sells the money and makes more.
Terrible business prospects. Selling all
Sell
the
the
money.
money.
I suppose there's a reason they got bought out. That's a good point. I that's my first note is actually the use of Wolverine over other characters. Because obviously in the comic, which we'll talk about later, it was Shadowcat.
Mhm.
In the animated series, which a lot of people come into X-Men through, it was Bishop.
Yes, I actually rewatched that once I'd watched this.
So yeah, I mean, obviously they had to take the Jewish girl and the black man out of it and replace him with a white male. Yeah,
As-
I mean,
As two white men in our 30s, I think we're entitled to talk about this.
we're entitled to a lot of things. Yeah. So I mean, I do feel like it is a certain misstep, but then I think that Fox's X-Men run has largely been focused around the same 3 white males since the beginning, really, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, Magneto, Charles.
And yeah, exactly.
Wolvie.
It's nice that they tried to include those other characters in this film.
Yeah,
But-
I mean, the opening, well, the future scene, should I say, could have been a lot more. They could have made that a good half an hour of the story.
Probably wasn't it?
Extra.
I know what you mean.
I feel it jumped around a bit too much for me. That you had the first sort of fighty scene in the future, and then it's like, here's all these characters. Oh, they're all dead now. Sorry, spoilers. But yeah, I think that as soon as they get the main sort of story down and the whole plot point comes out where he's being set back in time,
Yeah.
it's again, like you said, it's Charles, it's Logan, got Kitty involved,
Yeah.
and Magneto's just there.
And they did justify why it had to be Wolverine, but I felt like the justification came after they decided it was going to be him rather than it being necessary to the plot. It wasn't like, there's only one way we can tell this story and it has to be Logan. It was sort of...
Yeah, it was just put him in there.
Yeah, it's going to tear your mind apart, but what if we get someone who can heal?
Also, how many days would you say he was in the past for?
A week? I don't know, maybe not.
He was just stood there for a week.
Well, I don't really know.
Just holding his head.
I don't know if it was in real time or sped up. Because we'll see again in the comics, they just sort of tote Kitty around unconscious the whole time, don't they? But like they don't have to constantly stand there. I mean, another thing is obviously Kitty Pryde introduced in The Last Stand.
Yeah.
As with her comic character, has phasing powers where she can go through walls. Apparently, in the film verse, she also has a power to send people back in time through their mind.
Yeah, that was explained fully and absolutely fine. No comments there.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's almost like, as we said, we'll touch on this later, but one of the characters from the comics, they were just like, oh, I like that power, we'll give it to Kitty. There you go.
That was
Don't have to explain.
They pretty much did. I mean, and that was very much how Fox has sort of handled their X-Men films through most of it is, take a character that people recognize, insert them, and it doesn't really matter if their powers are their powers or their personalities are the same.
I did like how it incorporated it to the previous films in this particular run,
Yeah.
like First Class. No, it was First Class,
It's
wasn't it?
First Class Days of
This
Future
isn't the
Past.
third one.
This is the second one.
Second one, yeah.
Mhm.
So there are bits Mystique is going through files as Trask,
Yes.
and there are little sort of flashback points
hmm
which showed previous characters from the previous film.
Yeah.
But again, they sort of just wrapped that in this little box, and there we go.
Well, they
Done.
killed them all off. In a dossier, they look
Yeah.
through a dossier and just go, right, well, that character's dead, that character's dead. All these main characters, there we go. And then Charles gets sad about it and has a drink. I've always been of the opinion that, every character is someone's favorite. Someone whose favorite character is Iron Fist, it's very disappointing to see your favorite character on screen not done well. All I'm saying is everyone has a favorite character, and every character is someone's favorite. So when you mistreat a character, when you change their powers and you do weird things with them for the screen, it might not mean much to most people, but the people who it does, they're the ones who are going to get annoyed. So when you see a random, your favorite character get killed off screen in a dossier, oh, look, Emma Frost, oh, she's dead. Oh, here's Banshee. Oh, he's dead. There's a lot of these changes that you see in X-Men film, and it's a lot something they've done throughout the run, all the way since the beginning. Is they've introduced famous characters just to say, look, it's that character you love, and now they're dead.
Bye.
Yeah, the first time Psylocke died when they in the Last Stand, barely even recognize her as Psylocke, and she sort of runs out and gets disintegrated. But yeah, so I mean, I just think that some of the handling of certain characters, I think, has been pretty poor throughout the Fox franchise.
Yeah.
I think generally speaking, the more they focus on a certain characters, the better they are. Introduce a load more characters, and they all just sort of fall by the wayside. They're there as a sort of pop up, and then they just disappear, or they die. But yeah, that's a general problem. I mean, in this film, obviously, we've got a bunch of random mutants. We've got Warpath, Sunspot, Blink, Toad, all just sort of thrown in there for aesthetic value. Here, look at some cool powers.
Yeah, that's something that I did sort of realise when they were first in the future. Got to think about this in a certain way. Where you've got Sunspot, you've got Kitty, you've got Colossus, you've got Blink, Warpath, Bishop, Iceman, Professor X, Magneto, and Logan.
We should probably say at this point that we're watching the original theatrical cut, not the Rogue cut, which puts more emphasis on Rogue as a character.
Yeah, I've not seen that. I've seen I've seen the clips, just not watched the Rogue cut.
Yeah,
with air quotes there.
It's comparable in quality. I don't think it makes the film any better or worse. It's just there. But yeah, they definitely have an aspect to these films where they just say, "Hey, look, isn't that cool?" Anyway, moving on to Wolverine. But yeah, there was some cool moments with Blink and the power usage. The use of portals was some really cool stuff that happens, and it all looks very good on screen. But tell me, well, I mean, even if we hadn't have known that character was called Blink, would you know from that film?
No,
really?
I actually had to look up who it is. I kind of guessed Sunspot because of cartoons and what I've seen.
Well, this is because my problem is with Sunspot is he is a character who is regularly whitewashed, even in the comics, and because he is Afro-Latino, he is a black Brazilian or mixed race actually, and that was his first comic appearance as he is being bullied for being mixed race on the football field, and it's something that colorists in the comics have got it wrong and just painted him as more often than not straight white. And then obviously when they've adapted the films, they've just done that. Both times they've adapted his powers for the films, from what I can see I've not actually watched New Mutants yet, but from what I can tell by the trailer, he's got fire powers.
Yeah.
And in this he has fire powers.
Yeah.
And in the comic he has super strength.
And in X-Men Evolution, he has fire powers from the sun.
So his powers are, because he's a sunspot, so he's the black part of the sun, not the fiery part of the sun. So when he turns his powers on in the comics, he turns like fully black.
Yeah.
And he's got these sort of bob bubbles that emanate from him.
Okay, yeah, that is his look in Evolution.
Yeah.
Is he's black and then he's got the fiery red around him, or yellow or red around him.
And I think in his comic book powers have changed slightly over time, but he's never had full on, as far as I know, never had full on fire powers, which is sort of that Sunfire's deal, not Sunspots.
And the Human Torch.
And the Human Torch, and probably half a dozen other characters as well, or more. But yeah, so his powers have always been. So not only do they change his race, they change his powers to be more like Sunfire. So at which point you've got a completely new character.
Yeah, and then I guess just by name he is.
He's Sunspot by name
Yeah.
only. Yeah. If you had made him Asian in this or Japanese, I would have said, "Oh look, it's Sunfire."
I don't think they actually say half of these names.
I don't think they do.
I think
actually.
they say Kitty and Bishop, and everyone knows Iceman because of the previous film.
Yeah.
I don't think the others are mentioned by name.
I think that's something that Fox have done throughout, actually. And in fairness, so have Marvel a little bit, is they've got this thing where they feel like the comic names are a bit silly, so they try and reduce the amount of times they're said. I mean, the amount of times that Hawkeye is called Hawkeye in the films,
Yeah.
especially the early ones,
Hmm.
is you can count on one hand. It's only later on where they get a bit more comfortable, people are getting to know these characters, that they actually start saying, right, well, let's just throw their superhero names. We'll throw more and more outlandish stuff. Whereas Fox has always tried to keep it quite grounded. But these powers are inherently stupid. They're inherently
Yeah.
over the top. So trying to keep it grounded and well, let's all wear black leather because that's a lot more sensible.
With this X-Men run being the first mainstream comic book film franchise, you can definitely see that in the earlier ones where they are toned down. They call him Scott rather than Cyclops, call him Logan, Jean
Yeah.
Grey, all these other names that they don't really show or express the characters who they are,
Yeah.
but also their comic book name.
I mean, they do the same thing actually multiple times. Is they have a scene where someone explains it to them and says, "Here are our superpower names," and then they have Wolverine make a joke about it, and then they move on and they don't really use their superhero names again.
Yeah.
And then they did the same thing when they all put on the leather outfits, and he explains the leather outfits, and then Wolverine makes a joke about it, and then they move on and they don't.
Yeah, there you go, done.
And they just keep doing stuff like that, and it's lampshading the idea of the superheroes, and it's almost a sort of derisory. Yeah, look, isn't that stupid? Rather than just leaning into it and going, yeah, okay, this is stupid. People in red, white, and blue stripes and helmets and all this stuff is nonsense. Wearing a cape.
Yeah.
And they, admittedly with the Avengers, they did the same thing. They had Tony Stark mocking Thor for the way he dresses because it's all very theatrical. But it almost feels like they're less ashamed of it with the Marvel films.
Yeah, it just made me think of Captain America. His outfit in the Avengers is very cartoony, very bright, but they do make comments about it, and there are little jokes in there.
But they never then just got rid of it.
Yeah.
Which I found that throughout the X-Men films, they've often had the characters in the costumes, like the end of First Class. They're in those comic accurate blue and yellow outfits, and then the next film they're just not there.
There was a couple of tweaks on their final look, and then there are blue-ish outfits in Apocalypse.
Yes, there were bluish outfits, but at the end of Apocalypse, they all got their own individual outfits.
Apocalypse own individual outfit. Dark Phoenix, the newer one.
Yes.
Kind of blue outfits.
They're coming back to.
They ignored the last scene of the previous film.
Exactly, and they keep doing this. They keep saying, right, we're going to go look comic accurate. Everyone gets their own identity, their own costume, and then they backpedal. And they did it. End of First Class. They all get their comic accurate First Class outfits. Then this film, the school's gone, everyone's gone. They've all joined the army. It's none of it's referenced again.
Sad,
exactly.
And Beast is not Beast.
And they just
which annoys me.
It's like they try and reset the status quo with each film.
Yeah.
And rather than just having a continuity.
Each film is a jumping off point for someone. They try and make it a little bit like you don't really have to watch the old ones. If you have, good. If you haven't, you'll get the gist of it.
Exactly. Whereas I struggle to think that anyone going into Endgame without having seen 21 films that came before it is going to have any sort of idea of what's going on, really. It's one thing to say, okay, right, we want to make each film, and there's something we talk about in the comics as well, is every film, it could be someone's first film.
Yeah.
So let's, make everything as accessible as possible. But what they do with that is they also then jettison continuity. They get rid of it and just say, well, those characters in the last film are all dead and we've all changed outfits. And then the next film, you've got a whole bunch of new characters, and that's kind of what they did with this new trilogy. It became 4 films. Is because they jumped forward 10 years between each films. You had one in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, despite the fact that none of the characters aged properly in that time. You have this resetting point. There's been 10 years of history, or 8 years of history, or whatever it is, in between those 2 points that you just don't see. Is that interesting to see, to watch as a viewer?
I mean, I know that, as we just said, each film is like a starting off point for someone.
Hmm.
This, to me, was the film that was trying to merge the classic 1, 2, 3 with First Class, and then to make a new franchise with both actors with the same character.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think, in fairness, as far as that goes, it does a pretty good job. And it, has a solid conclusion to the franchise. It doesn't all line up perfectly, but as far as things go, there are problems with the film, and it's the same problems that they've had in all of the X-Men films, in my opinion. But it still does what it does pretty well, and
Yeah.
it does tie things up, and it does, it tells the story with the characters it wants to tell, even if that is the same storyline that's been used before in the films, which is, Magneto teams up with them, they trust him reluctantly, he inevitably betrays them, and then goes on his own way. It just keeps happening. It happened in about 4 of the 7 X-Men films, and the other 3 he was just the bad guy. And it's like, in the comics, obviously there are other bad guys, whereas the Fox films just seemed reluctant to do something that wasn't involving Magneto. So he's in every single one.
He was either the one who was the big bad,
Mm.
or he was making someone else go off and do these things for me.
Yeah,
and I'll hang back.
But even in the ones where he wasn't the big bad, he was the inevitable betrayer who they had to fight at the end of the film. And he's always going to be, he's our main enemy. It's like, well, you just make it someone else. I suppose the only one they don't do that in is First Class, where they have Sebastian Shaw, and even then he still ends up betraying them. But yeah, I mean, the other thing I noticed in this film is there's a lot of exposition, a lot of people, especially the early scenes of this, and this first sort of 20 minutes of the film, is just scene after scene of someone telling someone something that they should already know. Someone turns around and says this, and then there's a voiceover telling us what the history is, and then someone turns around and tells someone else something, and it's just that after that. Even when Wolverine goes back, so Wolverine goes back to the past, he goes to the thing, and then Beast expositions to him and tells him everything that's happened in the past. And it's just that for about half an hour of film. It's just people telling people things rather than us actually seeing any of this.
They could have probably cut a lot of that and just either trusted the audience know it and you'll pick it up, or turn that into a scene.
Yeah.
Not just, he's not here right now because XYZ.
Yeah.
Moving on.
And then again, even the unspoken exposition, the dossiers with all the dead people in and stuff like that. And it's like, we don't even need that as exposition. We don't need to know where these other characters are. They're not here. Okay, you don't want to include them, fine, but you don't.
The only characters that are actually in there are Azazel and Angel. You don't see a picture of Frost or others. I think Emma Frost's name's drop later on. I think when she's talking to Charles.
She says they're dead, though, doesn't she, later on? So she looks through the file and then says...
Yeah, in the file, the camera view sees Azazel and Angel. I'm assuming she's also seen Frost. But I know that she does say that to Charles and Eric later on.
Yeah.
But also there are 2 in there that just says G. Federber, probably saying that wrong, and E. Kephart.
Right.
Which these are 2 non-comic book characters.
Yeah.
The G. Federer is the movie set director, and then the E. Kephart is Elsa Kephart, who's the art department clerk.
So these are the people sort of in charge of
Easter
props.
Eggs. Yeah. Which I always questioned, because I always look for these things. I'm that person who I'll pause and go, right, let's look at all these names.
Yeah.
I saw those 2 names come up, and I was like, that's got to be something. And it is, but it's not.
But it's not related to it.
It's not a villain from the 80s or something.
No, it's something for the makers of the film as opposed to fans of the film.
Yeah.
That's
exactly. I did like the Pentagon scene.
Actually, there's a couple of really good fight scenes and really good action scenes in it. And that's what I think it does well, actually, out of all the films, is probably the future scenes we see are probably the best scenes of X-Men being a team and fighting together that we see throughout the franchise.
Yeah.
Because other than that, they're all quite individualized. We see it in the first one, it's all sort of people split off into 2s and fight each other. And then the second one, again, same thing happens. And this is probably the first one we see powers being used interactively.
Yeah.
Creating a portal, Colossus jumping through it, going down in gravity. And
he goes down about 4 or 5 times and then smashes into the Sentinel.
Yeah. She drops him and then puts the portal that way, and he flies sideways into it. And stuff like that. And Bishop shooting his guns into the portals to kill things. I mean, his powers, again, were very strange. I don't quite understand how Bishop's powers work. Was it entirely used for this gun? Was he born with the gun attached to him?
Yeah, I never got that. I know that he was a Sunspot.
Yeah. So
does
he was
fiery
a fiery
thing.
Yeah. So
I am doing hand things here.
Gestures for the listeners.
Just for the listeners, I'm doing hand motions here.
Bishop in the comics and in the cartoons, his powers are sort of about energy manipulation. You absorb energy and fire it, which is basically every 90s superhero's powers. It's basically, they loved just people who could fire energy because it meant that they could just draw that. Just people putting their hands out and energy firing. It doesn't matter where the power was coming from. So that was Bishop's power. And in this, he sort of channeled power into a gun and fired it from a gun. So is the gun integral to the power? Was the gun designed to harness his power?
Some output for his power.
Yeah. I mean, this is, again, things that because the character is just there as an aesthetic to go, hey, Bishop, it doesn't really matter. They don't explain his powers, don't need to know. He's got powers. There's something to do with a gun. Same with Gambit in X-Men Origins Wolverine. What's his powers? He can move cards with his mind? Sure, why not?
He likes poker?
He can helicopter on a stick.
Oh, that was the best scene in that thing. Anyway, let's not go down the road of Logan.
Yeah, let's just start slating other films.
Sorry, not Logan. Wolverine Origins. I should call it by the correct name.
X-Men Origins Wolverine.
All right.
But yeah, no. So I think the future scene where they have the big action scenes. It's the best part of the X-Men actually fighting together, working together as a team. And then, like you say, the Quicksilver scene in the Pentagon. Excellent.
Yeah, one of the, in my opinion, greatest scenes to show someone's power. Even the small bits as well, because when you do see him and it's super slow and he's running around, you can see tape hanging from his back, like his belt.
Oh, the gaffer tape.
Which is what he used earlier on.
Yeah.
Which I thought little things like that, perfect, because
it's nicely done.
You don't see him put that down on the floor. He doesn't put it away. But you just see him when he's running around the walls.
Of course, because of that character that they made so powerful, they then had to spend 3 films figuring out a way to get him out of the fight.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Every single film after this is him getting his leg broken or just turning up late or getting hurt.
This one was just, take this car back.
Yeah.
What?
Sorry, I'm really powerful. Shall I come with you? I could literally kill everyone in one go. No.
I might get a ticket. Do you mind taking the car back for me?
It's a rental, and it has to be back by midday, and you're the only one fast enough to drive.
Drive that car fast. Not how it works, Charles.
Yeah, so I kind of liked the way they did his power, but he massively overpowered.
Yeah.
And they kind of did this with a lot of characters throughout the series, is they show one big, like, look how cool his powers are, and then the rest of it you go, oh, why isn't Charles Xavier just wiping everyone's mind all the time? If he can just freeze everyone in an airport, why doesn't he?
Everyone stop and forget.
Yeah.
There we go. Problem solved.
So you could have done this from outside. You got mind powers. You know, I think there's some really good aspects to this, the fight scenes and stuff like that. I think they work really well. My problem with it comes when the sudden inevitable betrayal of Magneto, and then he becomes the main focus of the film. When you've already had actually this build up with Sentinels and all of these other things that could be the villain, you know, Peter Dinklage's character, and then no, it's Magneto again, and Magneto controlling some quite ropey looking robots that are easily defeated.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer that look of them than in the future.
Yeah.
It's more comic accurate, so similar to the comics and similar to the 90s TV show. But what I don't like, and as you sort of touched on, is once they've done the whole scene with Mystique and stopping her from assassination, it then just goes, right, well, that's that plot done. We've got an hour left this film. Magneto bad? Yeah, let's make it bad again. Yeah. Oh no, he's doing stuff for the president, and
Well, this is another thing with these films where, you know, they clearly didn't bank on Jennifer Lawrence becoming as big a star as she was. So for some reason, Mystique cannot turn into another character for more than 5 minutes. So she just, you know, she goes into an office to look at those files.
You've got to see her face though.
Yeah. Well, she turns into Peter Dinklage. She goes up the stairs, goes into the office, and as soon as she's past the secretary, she turns blue again.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that secretary can and does walk into the room later on. Just stay as Peter Dinklage. You don't need to change.
Talking about exposition, she turns up and the receptionist's like, hey, I thought you were supposed to be on this flight. Here's all the details. It's like, oh yeah, I'll come to get a folder. Okay.
I often tell people where they're going. I like to say to people, you know, you're meant to be on this, you know, flight 211 from LA to Washington.
Oh no, I'm late. That's today?
Yeah. They're trying to shoehorn Jennifer Lawrence in a lot more than they necessarily would have done if she hadn't have become famous in that time. You know, we have to make her a part of the X-Men, so we have to put her on the team. We have to, so inevitably she has to turn good by the end. I mean, as I say, the story it's telling is fine, but I just question some of the reasons they're telling that story.
Yeah, they
You know,
could have.
They want to use Wolverine more. They want to use Jennifer Lawrence more.
What they could have done, and we'll get into this in a bit, was they could have used some of the Brotherhood in this film, and then when they save Mystique or stop Mystique,
Yeah.
then one of those guys could become the big bad for the finale.
Exactly.
That could have worked.
They could have easily done that. In fact, Magneto, again, speak about this in a minute, but Magneto not in the comic.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
a sprinkle of him.
yeah, exactly.
He's more seasoning.
The Brotherhood that is in the comic is Mystique's Brotherhood.
Yeah.
It is her group that she's committing these acts and doing the bad things that are going to screw everything up. And they kind of do that the first half of this film. But like you say, the last hour of the film or the last 45 minutes of the film, it's just straight up, oh, Magneto's bad again now. Let's stop him. And it becomes the same plot as every single other X-Men film. But it's still better than most of them.
Although I must say, the Vietnamese general has got a good taste in whiskey.
Oh, really?
It's Johnny Walker Black Label.
Okay.
Which
That's good, is it?
that's a good whiskey. One of my favourite whiskies.
Oh, good.
I have had it.
Yeah, no, I
I'm not
believe you.
pointing
I'm not questioning it.
Although he is a bit of a bad man, so
He
maybe.
seems all right. He didn't do anything wrong, did he, in the film?
No, he doesn't, but she does.
Yeah, as him. Did I tell you this is the worst ever experience of my life in the cinema?
No.
It is the worst film. Honestly, I'm quite glad I got to rewatch it actually at home because I saw this in the cinema when it came out. And it wasn't like as soon as it came out. It was about a week afterwards. I saw it on a middle of the day, you know, a third full, this cinema. So I'm watching it. It's fine. Everything's going on nicely. And I'm noticing there's someone talking behind me. And I think that's kind of annoying. But okay. And then I realized after a while that they were, obviously, whoever they were with didn't speak English. And they were translating the film for them live. So every time someone said a line afterwards, this guy would say it.
Just the entire thing.
Just that through the whole film. It was right behind me. So I thought, that's kind of annoying. About halfway through the film, around the time of the Pentagon scenes, someone's phone goes off over there loud, you know, and a proper like cartoon diddly-doo, diddly-doo. That ringtone, which is a polyphonic ringtone from the 90s. I don't really understand why they've still got it. But that goes off.
Does the translator behind you translate that noise into?
Yeah, it's very similar in whatever language. And then 5 minutes later, so obviously he doesn't answer it, but he lets it ring rather than just pressing a hang up. You know, lets it ring. That's annoying. 5 minutes later, it goes off again, and then sort of more time passes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and it goes off a third time. And then everyone in the audience has started just
come on, man.
Turn off your phone. He's like, it's not my fault. I can't help it if they keep ringing me.
It's your phone.
Turn your phone off.
Turn it off.
So I just came out of that film being really annoyed by my viewing experience. So after seeing the film, I was kind of I didn't really remember much about it. I came out of it mostly going, yeah, there's a couple of cool bits. It was a really annoying cinema experience. So I was maybe less enamored of it the first time around because of that. But actually seeing it again, I think it does a lot of things pretty well. It just has the usual failings of a Fox X-Men film.
Fox failures. They should have a little have a box set. Fox failures, and not the entire films.
Yeah,
just certain scenes of it.
Just a compilation of scenes. I mean, some of them would be the entire film.
There is a cameo of the director in this bit, which he's holding a camera as Mystique runs past him.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of less said
fact,
about the director, the better at this time.
I don't actually think we mentioned this, but there is a time change of when it goes from and to.
Yeah.
So this one is from 2023 back to 73.
Yeah.
Where the gap in the comics is a lot smaller, and it's because it had been released past the future date.
So the comics is 2013?
13, yeah.
And so they pushed it forward 10 years.
Yeah.
And then they went back further because they wanted to set it in the 70s rather than the 80s, which is obviously when the comic was written. It seemed a bit irrelevant, but I suppose they didn't want too long a gap between the films, probably.
But yeah, I did like, we've always touched on the Sentinels before, but there was the difference between the future ones and the previous ones.
Yeah.
So I like the previous ones because of the colour. The future ones, again, sticks to the plot of the film quite well, that you get DNA from Mystique to then give them the powers, which I saw one of them sort of iced up like Frost.
Yeah.
And again, that explains why she's dead. So kind of.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. It was like the Diamond Heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was one with the long nails, which I'm assuming is Deathclaw from X2.
Lady Deathstrike.
Near enough.
But yeah, no, I know what you mean. There's that illusion. I quite like seeing those little tropes, but more often than not, those future Sentinels were sort of just generic spiky blobs, and then they either
If
got killed off or they killed someone.
if someone's been attacked by fire, they'll turn to ice.
Yeah.
If vice versa, they'll turn to fire. I actually forgot how much I did enjoy the Patrick Stewart, the opening where he narrates.
Hmm.
I missed that, and I know that each film is like, oh, here we go again. Someone's going to talk about having the X gene, but rewatching it and seeing it, oh yeah, I missed this. His voice to me is Xavier.
There's a certain gravitas to
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
it's like, and you know it's an X-Men film. It's just it's like a little safety blanket of
Yeah.
Patrick Stewart's voice. Shall we move on to the comic then?
Yeah.
In that case, I mean, as you already said, it's only 2 issues really. It's literally like 50 pages. But the version that I've got, and I believe you read, was just the paperback collection.
Yeah. So there's the trade paperback that collected issues 138 to 143 of Uncanny X-Men, as well as a special as well in there.
Yeah.
Which are largely relevant to the main plot of Days of Future Past, but we read them anyway, just for completionist's sake.
The special, as you said, was Nightcrawler's Inferno.
So Nightcrawler's Inferno, which was largely just a sort of riff on Dante's Inferno, but with the X-Men. Obviously, Chris Claremont had been reading it that week and decided he wanted to draw some things from it. Largely inconsequential to what we're covering.
When you say things like that about that week, he read things, I just believe you. I assume that's true.
I'm more than, the last issue of this is blatantly written just after we had gone to see Alien at the cinema. Basically, came out shortly after Alien came out, and it's basically a big story about Kitty Pryde fighting the alien.
Which is issue 143.
Yeah, from a storytelling perspective, I'm more than sure that Chris Claremont just did that and would just be like, what did I watch this week? I'm just going, oh, that was good. I'm going to make a story about that. And he could, because he was in charge of X-Men, in its entirety, and relatively left alone. Because he basically took it from a nothing franchise to being the most successful franchise that Marvel had going. And, then they obviously wanted to create more comics, so they created the New Mutants. And he said, well, all right, well, I'm writing that. I'm not letting anyone else write. And then Wolverine, oh, well, I'm writing. And he would just do that. He just wouldn't relinquish control unless it was someone that he trusted or knew. I think Louise Simonson was the editor on X-Men and on New Mutants. She's the one who ended up taking over writing on New Mutants. And I think that was only because they had a long-standing relationship that he let her do that.
So when did he leave the X-Men? What decade?
The 90s.
90s.
Yeah, so he left shortly after the full reboot of
Uncanny X-Men.
Well, it was X-Men #1 is the comic's name, and it's still to this day the comic that sold the most copies ever.
Okay.
And that's because they did all the 90s things that you can expect, where there was 100 different covers, and they promoted it as going to be this is going to be a valuable object one day. It's X-Men #1. And
this is the X-Men.
Yeah, and because it sold something like 6 million copies, which you consider that nowadays things struggle to sell 30,000. Because it sold that many, it was found in every single dollar bin in the world. It is an issue that everyone has. You could probably find it online now for a couple of quid if you wanted to. It's not worth anything, but everyone thought it was going to be, so everyone bought 10 copies, one of each cover. Yeah, so he left shortly after.
You can't make something special. You can't say this will be a collector's edition. Yeah. But go out and buy all these copies.
It's very much what they did in the 90s. There's lots of covers with like trading cards on the front of them, or holographic foil covers and stuff like that. If you bought singles back then, there was lots of that. Luckily, Marvel went through a lot of financial difficulties and stopped doing that for the most part after that. They still do alternate covers and things like that, but it's less focused
on. Pulling it back to this particular run.
Sorry.
I mean, as we said, we did read the previous comics to the actual run of Days of Future Past. So there must be a quick way of saying that. Doft?
No.
No, okay.
No. Days of Future Past is fine.
we will not use that then. That's fine. I mean, the first one, I have read comics. I'm not saying that I've not. I've not sat down and read a comic for a good couple of years.
And am I right in saying as well that the comics you will have read would have been more modern comics, which has a different storytelling technique?
I'd say probably the most recent run that I can think of is Shadowland.
Yep.
That would have been noughties, 90s, I'm not sure when
Oh
that
no,
was.
easily 2000s.
Oh, there you go.
2010s, I think.
And a lot of the DC stuff as well, which would have been after the DC reboot, so after the All New 52. So more modern comics.
Yeah, it's all post 2000, 2010.
When I was reading the first issue of this particular book, 138, to me it did fly past a lot of things very quickly. I didn't realise it was supposed to be a, oh, by the way, this happened. It
Yeah,
just sort of went, here you go, here's all these things.
well, I think that's it, and I think this is why they included it in this collected edition. Is it is a recap issue?
Yeah.
And it's almost recapping to that point, sort of 20 years of history,
Yeah.
of X-Men history. It's Cyclops essentially just narrating what's happened to this point post Dark Phoenix Saab.
Yeah.
Which we'll come up to at some point.
I enjoyed it, but it's nice for them to recap it. It's just I didn't know it was a recap until I was about halfway through. It was very much like, oh, and then this happened. Oh, and then that happened. Oh, and then she was fine, and then she wasn't fine. So the point that it sort of skips very quickly over is the Phoenix, Dark Phoenix, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch joining the Avengers, Iceman and Laura Dane, and then Dr. Carl Linus, I want to say, as Lycus, as, or AKA
Sauron.
There you go. Over half of them I know. Well, there's 4 of them, so half of them I know, half of them I don't have a clue. But again, it's probably things that I've seen in other.
Yeah, it touches on some of the basically the more famous aspects of X-Men history at that point. And there was a lot of other stuff as well, but obviously it touches on the big storylines, the stuff that sticks around afterwards. And this is something that you see quite a lot in comics of this age is, again, this idea of every comic is somebody's first.
Yeah.
And so you have characters, and you have it in almost every single issue of this collected edition that we're going to read is characters will basically say, I'm Cyclops. I have got the power to shoot concussive force from my eyes, and this is my colleague Storm, and she can. And it will just have characters narrating and saying what they can do under what circumstances and who everyone is. And even in Days of Future Past, you have the same thing in issue 1. You have a character walk in, and then narration says, "Oh, here's Blob, here's Toad, here's." And then the next issue, when they're all fighting, it does pretty much the same narration, just worded different. And it's this mandate at the time, which was, every comic is somebody's first, so you have to be introduced to each character per issue. Now, admittedly, comics back then, they sold more. So you could say, it worked. That's brilliant.
I mean, I did notice, and covering the whole 6 runs that we're talking about here, is that every time Logan gets out his claws, it's like, oh, and there's his impossible to break claws.
Yeah.
And each time they come out and each time they go in, they really hurt him. And they say that every time he gets his claws out. I'm like, I know. You said that 4 pages ago.
Yeah. They're very much more, they're written more like prose at the time. Whereas modern comics are a lot more cinematic, filmic in their storytelling. So they are much more reliant on, showing a panel-to-panel transgression without any dialogue or word boxes or anything like that. Whereas the old ones, they would show an outside of a building, and they would always have to say what building it was and where it was, or how people got there, rather than just assuming the reader can figure out that, okay, they were in Dallas, they're now in New York, they probably got on a plane.
Yeah.
It would always say a short plane while later,
It could be very much like, oh, let's head off to New York now. And then the next page, you expect them to be there already, or there. And you're like, oh, NY. It's like, we know they're there because they just said they were going there. And they've explained us that they're there and how they got there, even though they told us that they're going there via that way. It's too much. It's a lot of words.
Yes.
In a very confined space.
It is. And a lot of it is unnecessary. In fact, if you can go through these comics and remove a lot of the text or skip over a lot of the text, and you don't lose anything, the art is all there. There's some really good, turns of phrases and things like that in there. There's some good, fun dialogue, but there is a lot of it.
Talking about fun dialogue, there's also the opposite of that. Anti-fun, and I will now coin that phrase.
Anti-fun.
Anti-fun phrases.
Yeah, they should come up with a better word for that.
But... I thought this was Cyclops who said this. So throughout the whole issue, I guess, I didn't like him.
Right.
And I went back just to check, and it's actually Angel that says this.
Okay.
It's the point when Jean Grey turns up, and the quote is, "A redhead, look at that face and the rest of her." Very, very creepy, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I thought that was Cyclops. So I thought, how the hell has this guy then got with her after saying that? So maybe not like him.
Yeah.
Turns out Angel was a little bit of a creep.
Angel. But, At that point, Angel was a rich playboy type character, and this thing about Cyclops is he's much more of an introverted character than people give him credit for. He's often written off as boring, whereas actually in those first issues, a lot
That's
of the
why
early
that
things.
line shocked me so much, because I thought that's him saying
Yeah.
that. Look at her face, great. Oh, look at her body, even better. I'm like, Cyclops, you are a dog.
You dog, you.
But yeah, just
It worked though, didn't it?
oh, it worked. I mean, happily together after all these years,
Yeah.
and no drama at all.
But yeah, I mean, so basically the first issue of this is Cyclops recaps everything up until that point and then leaves the team.
Yeah.
Which is the big twist ending. And this does say it's post Dark Phoenix, so he's just killed off a character.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has another one just leave the team. And this is what Chris Claremont, he wanted to do at the time. He wanted to have it more of a rotating cast.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted it to be evolving and ever changing, and we're going to bring in these new characters and we can write those out and give Scott his happy ending. And editorial would often then say, well, no, especially in the 90s, because what you have is this whole new wave of artists coming through who have grown up reading Chris Claremont's comics, and they wanted to draw those characters, and they wanted to only draw those characters.
Yeah.
So there was this sort of time in the 90s where they basically wanted to sort of reset, and which is what they did, X-Men #1.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, it's something that Marvel have always wanted to do and always will do, to be honest. It's this idea of renewing the status quo.
Yeah.
They want change of the story, but they also don't want to kill off any of the cash cows.
Of course, yeah. You wouldn't sell your best player in the NFL.
Yeah.
There you go. Nice American
good. Yeah.
reference.
Americans will eat that up.
American
Love a bit of
football. Although, to be fair, we do watch it. But yeah, I mean, you're not going to get rid of your best player or your best character. The reason people read and watch these things.
Yeah, it's people's favourite characters. But I mean, the difference, obviously, the best player is at some point your best player will have to retire, whereas with comic books, you never have to do that. They've got this sliding time scale with Marvel, which means that everything that's happened has happened within the last 15 years, no matter when it is. So it's always sort of pushed and continually updated. Obviously, DC do the other thing, which is the rebooted universe. Is that
Quick, scrap it.
Yeah. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. They've had varying success with that. But, I mean, we'll go into that, I'm sure, in another episode at some point.
Wait, we've got to do more of these.
Well, maybe not. We'll see how well this one goes. So, from a new reader's perspective, these first few issues, there's 2 standalones, a special and a 2-parter before we get to Days of Future Past. What were your thoughts on those in terms of...
As we've already sort of touched on, I think I am a more current reader, as in stuff that's come out the last 15, 20 years, rather than the older stuff, which once I got into it, fine. It was fun to read. Hard to read when I first started, but when you start to understand the characters, and I tend to realise, okay, it's not the character from the 90s TV show. Oh, it's not the character from X1. Yes, by name, but they're not written in the same way or acted in the same way. So it is nice to see what they were portrayed as back then. Again, very sort of hard to get through. A couple of good chunky paragraphs and gone, you've used too much language there, it's too complicated. But yeah, I enjoyed it, and I can definitely see there are little snippets of inspiration that's been sprinkled across the films and the TV shows and bits and bobs like that.
It's more a case of, Chris Claremont, he wrote these comics and he had almost complete creative control. It's not a case of sprinkles. He defined these characters as they became, well, what he created or at least took and ran with and made them into something else. All of the major stories you can imagine, everything that's been adapted into, a film or cartoons or anything like that has almost certainly come from this era.
Yeah.
This Claremontian era.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that I said before, the sprinkling of themes and what you can see. Just for example, like in X-Men Origins Wolverine, the 2 old people that help him out, their names were almost inspired by issue 140. You've got James McDonald and Heather Hudson, I want to say.
Yeah.
But those types of things, they're little Easter eggs that call back to this era.
Yeah. This is the most famous X-Men era. Most people will not have read these comic books, but they'll know things from it. Because things like Days of Future Past, which has had a massive knock-on and is literally 2 comics of a monthly comic book run that lasted for 14 plus years. These were coming out all the time, thick and fast. And, okay, there's probably as much we've forgotten as we remember and we care to remember. The big arcs. This was sort of very influential in its scope. And as I say, you watch X-Men, the animated series, which is a 90s take on these things. But X-Men, the animated series, was made again by people who probably grew up reading Claremont stories. And pretty much every story arc in it was influenced in some way by these stories.
Yeah.
And then that has a knock-on effect of obviously a lot of people getting to X-Men through the X-Men animated series, and they're the stories again they're familiar with.
Let's say you were to read this and then watch the 90s cartoon of this particular plot. So it's the two-parter, I think it's season 4, I want to say, season 3, which, that it does send back the wrong character rather than in the comics. In the cartoon, you've got more similarities and more sort of major plot points than in the film.
Yes,
definitely. Definitely the future scenes in the show are the same as this. So it's the sort of old New York style rather than this futuristic.
I mean, and that helped that Bishop himself in the comics is a time-displaced character already. He's from a different alternate universe. So all they've done really is said, right, well, instead of having 2 random dystopian futures, we'll have one, and we'll have that one character actually travel back in a Terminator-like way, as opposed to it being a mind swap thing.
Right, I think we've spoke a lot about the previous issues in this collection.
Well, there's a couple of bits I still want to touch on, because obviously the main job of these previous issues was to introduce Kitty Pryde.
Yeah.
I think. And that because obviously she plays a central part, and she is literally introduced in these issues. This is her first appearances in X-Men. But what do you think about the present that Wolverine gives to Kurt in his special, to Nightcrawler? He gives him a giant framed photo of himself. Wolverine decides to give him Kurt.
I had not picked that up.
Opens it, they have a conversation about it, and Wolverine is there eating the biggest turkey leg in the world, like, I don't know, sort of the back leg of a cow. He gives Nightcrawler a giant picture of himself.
Yep, just a big old picture of Wolverine in his costume.
In his costume, yeah. Because that's what everyone wants of their best friend. Here, friend, if I got you for your next birthday, your birthday's in January, right? I'll get you a giant picture of myself, and I'll frame it.
I've already got one of you framed. But you weren't supposed to know about that.
Is that for my birthday?
I'll give you a picture of yourself framed in it for a birthday. Is that less weird or more weird?
It's more weird because where did you get that photo?
From my special collection.
I just wanted to touch on that really. 139 issue. We are introduced to a new character, Stevie Hunter.
We are indeed.
The dance instructor. Now this is
pop quiz for you.
Yeah.
Do you know what car she owns?
No.
It's a Saab. It's just a fact. It's a fun fact.
It's a fun fact for all our listeners.
It's a fun fact for the car she owns is a Saab.
Okay, well,
it's not in this issue. I found that out. Did some research and I found that out that she owns a Saab.
Did you find out
that is one of her key
personality traits?
Is she owns a Saab. I don't know what comic that came from, but I can definitely find out.
We'll find out next time.
If you're listening into this and you want to find out more,
we'll let you know in a future episode in which comic it's referenced that she drives a Saab. Good.
I'm sure there was a reason you brought up.
So Stevie Hunter, no, there was a reason I was bringing up Stevie Hunter. And the reason is because this is something that Chris Claremont used to do as well, is he would bring in quite a lot of non-superhero supporting cast.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Stevie Hunter before?
No.
Exactly. There was a lot of characters like this who were sort of introduced and were around for ages and have largely been dropped, especially in the 90s, because there was so much of a focus on bringing back all of the other X-Men and having this cast be as wide as it could possibly be, you know, all hundreds of them. Whereas always quite a tight cast before, which allowed room for the side characters to back up the love interests, this, that, and the other. But yeah, let's say it's something that's not really translated into the films either, is these human allies.
Yeah.
I think the only one that has really is Moira McTaggart.
Literally about to say that, yeah. That's the only one that I could think of.
Shall we talk about Days of Future Past?
I think we shall.
So, issues, 141 and 142, Days of Future Past. The story, which is kind of reminiscent of the film.
Yeah, I mean...
little bit. Not really. There's time travel.
Yeah, there's time travel, there's some deaths, a lot of deaths.
And they've got to change the past.
And
the Sentinels.
In the comics, it was very much a country event. In the film's very world event.
Yeah. The motivation for sending someone back is completely different. Obviously, in the film, it's to stop Mystique from assassinating Bolivar Trask.
Yes. She assassinates him.
They capture her. She tries to assassinate him, and they capture her. And then they use her DNA to...
This is when timelines get confusing. Because are we talking the original timeline that led to the future?
Yes.
We're not talking the film timeline.
In the film,
the
reason they send Wolverine back is to stop Mystique from getting captured whilst attempting to assassinate him.
Yeah, that does sound right.
That is right.
But I don't understand then Because in my head, if he'd not gone back in time, then she'd be still on the run. Although no, she was still in a little bit of a vendetta.
Yeah, no, no.
That's why she goes because
she
she
goes-
goes to the US base before
Yeah.
she bumped into.
So until they meet up, her story is exactly the same.
Yeah, that
which
was
is-
just had to rethink.
Yeah,
yeah.
So yeah, the storyline is she's trying to assassinate Bolivar Trask in
Mhm.
this one, which is a character who's already been introduced in X-Men 3, I think.
Apparently, that character is only named Trask or Trask.
Okay, he was
Trask?
called Trask throughout, was
Yeah.
he? And there are a few Trasks.
That's only his,
in the comics.
that's his last name. He's not mentioned, I think, as
Bolivar.
thank you. Yeah. So in theory, it doesn't have to be the same character, but I guess that was like sort of an afterthought of going, oh, what about
Yeah.
X3?
Days of Future Past obviously starts in the future.
X-Men Days of Future Past comic starts in the future because the opening is 2013 New
Right.
York,
Okay.
Manhattan, which throws you off a little bit because you
Yeah.
got to go, oh, Kitty, that's Kitty, but that's not the Kitty that we've just been in.
Yeah, I think they almost
that's
call
not
it. Do they call her Kate in this?
They do call her Kate, yeah, Kate Pride, but you don't know Pride until Logan just appears out of nowhere. It's like, Kate, come
Yeah.
here.
But yeah, so basically the plot of it revolves around Kitty Pryde going back to stop Mystique from this time assassinating Senator Kelly.
Yep.
And obviously in the films,
hmm
Senator Kelly was in the first X-Men.
Yeah, he's alive late 90s, early noughties.
Yeah. So it's 2000, the first
Yeah.
film. And he's the chap who gets turned into a watery mess and then falls through the bars and then dissolves.
And then he dies, and then he goes,
Yeah. And this is another case of them taking the name of a character
Yeah.
from and just going, well, give it to that guy.
I'll just chuck him in there.
Oh, we've killed him. Now we can't do Days of Future Past. How do we do Days of Future Past? Let's use Bolivar Trask.
Uh-oh, quick. Rethink.
So there's quite a lot goes on in these two issues.
hmm
So what do you think of that sort of style of things? The fact that you do get a whole storyline with alternate future, alternate past,
Mhm.
the changing of timelines, characters introduced, all happening within two issues.
It is a lot, but it doesn't feel like a lot because I feel like anyone who knows about the X-Men and knows a handful of characters, I mean, I know more than that, but anyone who knew a handful of characters, seen a film or two, and then read just these two issues, I reckon would be able to easily understand who's who and where things are going. So it is quite different going back reading an older style comic, but I reckon you could follow that style. And regarding the sort of fighting and then the text, yeah, I think the fighting could be a little bit more in depth. They could have more panels of it rather than just going, here's 4 panels of a fight.
Yeah.
Right, and move on.
Yeah, it's usually a still shot of someone using their powers in a creative way.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the depth of the fight scene as far
Yeah.
as it goes. But it does allow you to get that more storytelling into that issue, which is something that is a complaint about a lot of modern comics, is the amount of which they're watered down. You don't have as many big splash pages, which are just the whole page.
So yeah, it's a little harder to get through, but I did like how, yes, it is a big world-changing thing that's happening, but it all comes down to quite a grounded fight. There's no massive big scene. There's no.
It's not
quick-
the end of Endgame, is it? It's
No.
not two armies facing off.
Yeah.
It's literally
So
we have to
it's-
save this one man.
Yeah, I mean, and then as you and I know, the way that it happens in this is that you've got Blob, Toad, all of these
Avalanche and
Avalanche.
Pyro.
You've got all these characters that I haven't read a lot about, but they are trying to fight the X-Men whilst you've got one member trying to help save the target. It's a good read.
I know what you mean, though. At the time when they were writing this wasn't this wasn't meant to be something that was bigger than it was.
Mhm.
They didn't know this was going to be made into films and cartoons, wasn't going to be referenced in other TV shows. It just is something that captured people's imaginations and went running. So you're right, yeah, it's a smaller scale. It doesn't have that epic finale because it wasn't an event. It
Yeah.
wasn't, Civil War or Infinity Gauntlet or anything like that. It was just 2 issues. Here's the story, and then it just sort of took off from there.
Mhm.
But it still has that lasting impact, despite the fact that it was relatively throwaway 2-story arc.
I mean, what I like about the comic version is, yes, she goes back in time, she makes these changes, and then it goes back to the past, and they don't know. It's left open. Whereas in the films, you see a nice ending of the original in the mansion.
Yeah.
Where the comic, I quite like the fact that they go, oh, she's gone. Is what we've done acceptable?
It doesn't actually show you the future again.
Yeah.
And in fact, there is actually a sequel, Days of Future Present, But what did you think about some of the other characters used? So you touched on the Brotherhood of Evil. So you've
Mhm.
got Pyro, Blob, Avalanche. What do you think of those? You know a little bit about those characters, you know?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of these characters in the films.
Mhm.
Maybe not so much the Brotherhood, but characters that are in here and not in there, and vice versa. The Brotherhood, I haven't read anything with them in it. I know it all from, well, the X-Men films and talking 90s cartoon show
Yeah.
and X-Men Evolution. So as I was reading this, I got a sense of who Destiny was.
You mean Mystique's friend, Destiny?
Yes, friend with the air quotes.
Yes. Who,
Um,
due to the Comics Code Authority at the time, was only ever Mystique's friend and nothing closer.
okay, that was it.
Whatever you think about what you might have read,
No.
wasn't in there, right? It didn't happen.
Oh yeah, that one, yeah,
I
her
mean,
friend.
she was very upset about her friend's death later on.
But they're just friends.
They're just friends,
Oh
and
yeah,
this happened a
absolutely.
lot. In fact, you had the Kitty Pryde and Rachel Summers. There's literally a panel where she's eating cake off of another woman's fingers in a seductive manner.
Just friends.
Best friends,
Just
love
just
each
friends.
other,
Close friends.
close friends.
Do
It's
you
something that
know?
was not allowed at the time.
Do you know her real name? Destiny.
Her name's Irene Adler,
Yeah.
named after the Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. I was quite intrigued that it had literally had the exact same name.
I mean, again, this is a Chris Claremont thing where he will just pluck a name from something he's read or something he's seen or touched on earlier. It's the last issue of this comic is the Alien parody, where
Mhm.
she has a sort of nightmare about an alien. You are then later introduced into the Brood Saga, quite a famous storyline, but again, heavily influenced by Alien. You can see the influences throughout his work. And in fact, this one is actually attributed to Byrne, this storyline. He says he came up with this, but he didn't realise the similarities between it and an arc of Doctor Who that he had watched until after someone pointed out to him.
Of Days of Future Past.
Yeah. So Days of Future Past, someone said to him apparently later on, do you know that was pretty much a straight riff on Day of the Daleks from Doctor Who?
Never
And he
knew
went,
this.
oh yeah.
Going back to the Brotherhood. So yeah, as you said, there's Avalanche, Pyro, and Blob, with obviously Destiny. All three of them, as I said, I know from X-Men Evolution.
Yep.
I've literally the other day just finished watching X-Men Evolution season 1, and it's just weird to see that three of the main characters on her team in the comic here
Yeah.
is featured in that TV show. They've not ever done this particular run or this particular storyline. I did try and find it, but I can see going back.
There's definitely an inspiration.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, the comic, they refer to him being British a lot.
Yeah.
Which he's not.
I never got that.
All comics, there will be continuity errors. And yes, they did refer to him as being British.
Does that stay with Claremont's run? Or no?
His canonical origin is he's Australian.
And then there's Blob, which hasn't been in any film ever. They only made 6 films.
Yeah, and maybe that's too many.
He obviously is in
He
X-Men
is, and
Origin,
he's a character
Wolverine.
again with a very different power set, and is very much just there for the aesthetic. So
he's strong. I've not watched that film for years, but if I remember rightly, he's just like an army-style man. And then they split up the band, and then he just puts on weight.
Yeah,
that means that his powers in that film is just he's strong, and now he's fat.
I think so, yeah.
But in the comics, yes, he has got. I'm
his-
assuming he's got a backstory to why he's so big.
In the comics, his power is related to his fatness, whereas in the film, it was very much a case of this is his power. Oh, by the way, now he's fat. Whereas in this, he's the immovable blob. His whole entity, his whole power is that he could root himself to a spot, and you would not be able to move. Later on, that became super strength as well. Later on, they went, right, well, let's give him a bit more than that, because that is a bit of a weak power. Because what they found out is that you could just dig up the earth around him. And so they did sort of start giving him more super strength.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Juggernaut's power is he's unstoppable. You know, he can run in a straight line and nothing will stop him. But again, that's not that great a power until you start adding super strength on top of it. Because,
That's what we were saying, that with the films, they just use the Brotherhood or Magneto. And all the background characters they're just these people with these powers. You wouldn't see someone throwing fire and then you go, oh, it's Pyro. They've just given someone vague powers.
Yeah. You see it a lot when in the early films where they have like tracking through the school and they show a load of random characters having powers, teleporters and this, that, and the other. And it would have been easy to make those characters from the comics to say, right, well, here's a teleporter, well, let's make it Vanisher, or But they don't really do that. They just have random kids with powers that are very similar to other powers.
Yeah.
So that's Days of Future Past, the comic. What are your thoughts?
If you just handed me the 2-issue run and then I was to watch the film, I wouldn't really necessarily think it was coming from the same source. I enjoyed the comic a lot. The characters, the dialogue, the action, it comes together and it finishes well. I like the uncertainty of the ending. In the film, they went the opposite route. But yeah, overall, good comic.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think all of those things are things that I like about it. I think it's probably why it's resonated. A lot of changes from the comic to the film.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think worked and what do you think didn't work?
Some of these have already come up already, but I mean, you've got differences with who goes back and who sends them back. Rachel sends back Kitty in the comics, or Kate, and then Kitty sends back Logan. So it's almost like in the films they just gave the powers of Rachel Summers to Kitty
Yeah,
purposely just for this film. I think it works better in the comics because effectively you've got this young girl or teenager talking like an adult, and you can tell the speech changes and how she talks and the way she acts. I can picture that as if I saw 14-year-old. I think she's about 14, 15.
she's in fact, I can give you the quote. It's she's 13 and a half, cute, bright, and spunky.
Not how I would describe her. We're in a different era. If I was to see this young girl start talking in this very adult way, you would question it. You wouldn't know what was going on.
And I think especially important is the fact that she is a newcomer to the team.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer the way it's handled in the comics than in the films, because in the films you're just like, oh hi, I know you, you're Charles. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Moving on.
I think some of the changes have been done definitely to shoehorn major characters in as opposed to being organically. But I think the film, in terms of those changes, handles it more or less well. A lot of the aspects here are Days of Future Past, but in sort of name only.
But yeah, I think we've touched on the differences quite a lot. The similarity in both versions, the future, you've got Logan, Colossus, Storm, Kitty, and Magneto. Even though, as we said, just a snippet. So in both the future versions, you've got those 5 members.
And we have that aspect, which is on the second comics cover, which is everybody dies.
Yeah.
This aspect of the future is going to be bleak and all of these characters are slowly going to be killed off, but the lasting repercussions may or may not.
And also in the films and comics, Storm dies in a very similar way. It's a stab from a sentinel.
Yeah, those the visual nods as well as the story moments.
Yeah, which actually, touching on that, you've got Logan's grey sideburns or sides, which again, that's shown in the films and the comics. A nice way of showing the aging. Yeah, the fight itself, it's quite private, and then it ends up going out on the streets.
Yeah.
Not as obvious in the film because they're just having a little tiff.
Yeah.
And then they go chase her outside, and then it becomes a fight.
Exactly. And it ends up as almost an assassination attempt on the president by Magneto, as opposed to what it was in the comics, which is a lot more of a it's a high stakes, but the actual event itself, it's not a major event, but it has repercussions.
Yeah.
Whereas Magneto ripping up a ballpark, crashing it down on top of them, reprogramming all the Sentinels and trying to kill the president.
That's a totally different.
It's quite a big statement. You kind of feel like with the film, whether Wolverine was there or not, someone would get involved and try and stop this. I mean, this is your first foray really back into comic books.
Yeah, for a long time.
For a long time, and probably your first exploration of comics of this age.
Yeah.
And you'd say it was a generally positive experience.
It took me a while to get into it. Once I got into it, it was one of those things where you end an issue and you're like, oh, what's going to happen next? But not like, I need to read all of them right now.
Yeah.
So I think you can only read a certain amount on one sitting, otherwise you're going to get drained.
Yeah, and because it has the recap thing every issue.
Yeah.
Reading the same descriptions of the same characters over and over again. And so you can see how this would work as it was originally published, a monthly comic book. So is there anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I might have misunderstood this slightly, but in obviously the films, you've got Charles and you've got Eric, and they're like, right, we've got a plan. And in the comics, they meet up with old Magneto. And then he sort of says, well, this is what you could do. And then he dies off screen or off page.
Yeah. They say, oh, it's a shame we had to leave him behind.
So my sort of point here, do you think in both versions it was Magneto's plan?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, Chris Claremont brought about the sort of anti-villain side of Magneto, this idea of rehabilitating the character. So in later comics, he is entrusted to look after the New Mutants by Professor X. He just says, look, you're in charge now. Look after my school. And that was sort of this aspect of making him into a more morally grey character. In fact, in the future, in this comic, he is a straight up good guy. There's no reference to him being a villain. They talk to him like he's a hero. He looks after them. He's wheelchair bound, you know. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if that aspect of it carried over. So, if, like Ian, you enjoyed this comic and want to read more, then I have good news for you. Chris Claremont wrote X-Men for about 17 years, so there's a huge amount to get into. If you want to jump in with both feet, then his run has been collected into a number of omnibuses. Several of his more famous runs have also been collected into smaller trade paperbacks, and the vast majority of it is also available on Marvel Unlimited, the online Marvel subscription service. If you want to learn more about the X-Men in general, I would also recommend the excellent podcast Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men. That's our thoughts, but we would love to hear yours on the film, the comic, or on this episode. Our social media, much like this podcast, is very much a work in progress, so for the time being, you can get in touch by emailing us at becometheteapot@hotmail.com. We're going to try and upload an episode every fortnight. For any American listeners, that's 2 weeks' time. And as that will fall around my birthday, we're going to be looking at one of my favourites. So join us next time as we dive into the world of messy relationships, video game logic, and evil exes as we explore Scott Pilgrim versus the world.
Goodbye, everybody.